Well, the reflections bit is to show that I wasn't trying to cover everything. It's just the things I happen to be thinking about. And ravaged century, well, it's been a ravaged century. How many centuries have seen wars and massacres in which 20 million people get killed in peacetime in one country, 50 million in another, 20 or 30 million get killed in wars? I think it's been very much the most ravaged century, if you want to put it that way, of any for a very long time, anyway. Well, I think we've won through to some extent. We have got rid of the real driven ideologies, the horrors of Nazism and communism. Well, we haven't quite got rid of them, but at least they've lost their allure, they've lost any attraction they used to have, except here and there in a few backward countries and campuses, you know, that sort of thing. Well, first of all, their system didn't work in the countries they tried it out on. There used to be a joke in Russia, the Soviet Russia, is our system, was it invented by scientists? And the answer was, no, if scientists had invented it, they'd have tried it out first on hamsters. And that's a very true point, because it did ruin the country economically, ecologically, demographically. They lost millions of people. And it also stupefied and stultified everybody. They weren't allowed to think. The ones who rose to power were people who'd been forced their way up by hypocrisy and by stupidity. It became a rule almost. And they drove the country into the ground. Since 1981. I'm a dual national by birth, American and British, American United Kingdom. I've found a short essay I wrote at the age of 8 and a short poem I wrote at the age of 8 in an album the other day. I don't know if you count that as writing. Publishing, since my first two books were 1955. One was a science fiction novel, the other was a book of poems. I mean, published by proper publishers. On the historical side, well, I think two things. I'd been in the war in the Balkans from 1944 in Bulgaria, and then later in the British mission there, political. So I was there 4 years nearly. And I saw what happened when a communist regime took over, the terror and the suppression of thought and the ruin of the country. So when I got back, I got interested in communism in general. And in Russia, I found nobody was working on a lot of material that existed. My first book, I think the other answer is inquisitiveness. My first book was just about the struggle for power, the factions in the Kremlin. And this is very little known. You could only guess by various hints they dropped, various appointments. You know, so this wasn't a terrifically anti-communist book. It was an inquiry to satisfy my own inquisitiveness. I mean, people seem to forget that some people really want to find things out. I mean, I've got a piece coming out in next year's Journal of the Society of the Promotion of Roman Studies in England about the Roman place names of Scotland. Now, that's not due to any anti-communism or pro-anything. It's due to I got inquisitive about it. And I think that's the best drive for a historian. And that applied to all the books afterwards. Well, I say idea with a capital I mean one that isn't just a thought that you or I might have, but a big idea, not only a capital I, sometimes capitals throughout and exclamation marks and lights, saying, here we have something which is, we know more about the future, about the world, about humanity than anybody else does. Come our way and sacrifice anything for following us. And these are the ideas like fascism and communism. Well, the most important of these driving ideas were communism and fascism and National Socialism. But of course, communism lasted longer and had more of an attraction for people outside the country concerned. If you're not a German, you're not going to be a very good German National Socialist. But if you can be a communist anywhere. I mean, the National Socialists and Fascists identified with the nation, the people. You lost your individuality and identified with the nation. The communists, you identified with the masses. You lost your individuality just the same. You identified it, but it was a different concept, though they overlapped a bit, of course, in fact quite a lot. Well, the original thought was, of course, Karl Marx, but it goes back beyond that, I think. The French Revolution, at that time you get the idea of the terrorist state which can enforce the perfect society. And then Karl Marx said he discovered the science of society, how to predict the future, how everything will evolve if you do it my way. Well, if it's the only way, the scientific way, and you reject it, you're acting against reason, you're acting against knowledge. You have to be suppressed. And then, of course, we got it. Communism, these ideas appealed first to a section of the Russian intelligentsia, the Russian semi-educated class, because they had no notion of real politics. So they had the idea without any experience. And this sect took over this backward country in 1917. And from then on you had a large country run by utopian idea people who had nothing in their minds except the idea, and dictated how biology should run, how history should be, and also spread their influence with money and other methods throughout the world. He came from near Kazan, almost on the border of Russian and Turkic and other territory in Russia. No, it's the other way around. He became a revolutionary before he became a Marxist. He read a book said to be the worst novel ever written, called Chernyshevsky, which prescribed how the state could be taken over by well-meaning intellectuals and turned into a perfect state. But that didn't have any Marxism in it. So he started off as a revolutionary. Then Marxism looked even more attractive, because it looked modern. It wasn't just somebody saying we can have a perfect society, and a good German doctor has proved it. And then the Marxism goes from there. Mind you, he narrowed Marxism a bit. There were elements in Marxism which weren't as narrow as his. But what he had was a hell of a lot of willpower, as Stalin and Hitler did, of course. It's one of the things we neglect if we study history in courses. There are all sorts of theories of history, but very seldom they mention that one man, with a hell of a willpower and drive and ability in some respects, can produce this thrust. I've lived in America, but not until I was well over 30. I didn't come to America. My father was American, and my mother was English, and he was brought up. He was a Virginian, and his mother was from the north, and she moved to San Remo in Italy, and he was brought up in his young years, 10 years, speaking Italian and French, and then came back to America. Then came just before the First War broke out. They were in Switzerland. Came to England for the first time, met my mother. Then he joined the French army, the American ambulance, got the Croix de Guerre at Verdun, at the great battle of Verdun, the super battle of the war, and then remained very American, but settled in England and France. We lived. We always thought of ourselves as Americans. But when we were in France, of course, English and American boys associated together in what you might call, not gang in fights, with the locals. And our cry was Waterloo, and their cry against both English and Americans was English pig in England. 3 or 4 years. I went to university there later. Well, the usual amount of school and university, Oxford. I studied philosophy of politics and economics. Well, I saw quite a lot of her from several years before she became Prime Minister, yes. Well, I briefed her on what I thought the Soviets were up to. She was very willing to learn. She wasn't the first politician. The first politician I spoke to was the American Senator Scoop Jackson. That must have been 69-ish, because I suddenly got a call from the American embassy saying, "Can you come to a small party? As a senator, would like to meet you." So he just read one of my books, and he used to have me up giving evidence at his committee at the Senate a lot. And those hard Democrats were the first people I knew in American politics, him and Pat Moynihan. So, but this was all accidental. I didn't go pushing myself. Well, they wanted, I think, depending on, they weren't know-alls, if you know what I mean. They just wanted more information, more perspective on what was going on in Russia, on what the then very secret sort of, secretive at any rate, sort of leadership in Russia, what the earth they were doing, what the prospects were.